Wendy Whitman, Debbie Levison, and TM Dunn. Thank you for being on the show.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
So nice to be here.
Okay, I'm going to start with Wendy because I know Wendy. We have talked before. I've interviewed Wendy before, and it was so much fun having you on before. There was all kinds of cool surprises with your background and your writing and all that good stuff. So why don't you introduce yourself and tell us how you got into writing?
Okay, so I have a 20-year history covering crime in television, and it includes 15 years of court TV and another 4 years on the Nancy Grace Show. And the history of the channel was that court TV got shut down in 2009, and Nancy saved a bunch of us, and I worked there, for that period of time after that. But I always felt I had a book in me from covering so many horrific murder cases over the years. So that's how I got into writing. And my boss at Court TV's executive assistant is the one. She used to work at Warner Brothers Books, and she's the one who kept encouraging me to write a book. She said, "You got to write a book." And I said, "Well, I don't know if I can write a book." She said, "No, you got to do it. You got to do it." So it took me a number of years to figure out what to write and how to go about it. And I was initially going to write nonfiction, and then I realized I could do what I wanted to do in a nonfiction book and fiction, and it would be a lot less research. So that's how it came. That's how the writing came about. So I utilized my 20 years of covering crime really in the books, and that's what motivated me to do it.
Fantastic. Now, Debbie, same thing. Introduce yourself and how you got into writing.
Debbie Levison, no N in the middle. Well, I've been a lifelong writer, but always as a journalist and as a publicist, which is, very different writing and mostly ghost writing under someone else's name, but I've been published all over the place. And always wanted to write a book. I mean, that's been my longest, most cherished dream. And I just didn't really know what to write about, except for a sort of a romance, a really, really cheesy romance that went nowhere in the 90s. But then this story fell into my lap in 2010. It started where this murder that involved my family just sort of sent us all reeling. And so I started to write a true crime book, never having ever read a true crime.
Oh, wow, really?
Life.
Okay.
But I had to write about the murder.
Yeah, you did.
Like Wendy, everybody was pestering me, write a book, write a book.
Right.
Okay.
So I did. And then I wrote another one.
Cool.
And then another one.
Now, TM Dunn, how about you?
Well, I started writing and wanted to be a writer as a kid because I had a family that did a lot of talking and a lot of screaming, but not a lot of listening. And whenever I needed my parents to hear something, I would write it in a note and slip it under their door. This is still a joke that my family makes today, but they pay attention, right? And so it worked. So I saw the power in writing in that. And then I wrote elementary school, high school, but was doing a lot of journalism in my 20s, always also wanted to write fiction. And I didn't really come to writing fiction until, without telling anybody, I just, in my mid-30s, decided I was going to go to graduate school for an MFA. I didn't even tell my therapist, which she was surprised that I was doing that. And started writing, and I have other books published, but they are not thrillers like the one that I just came out. And I didn't know that I was writing a thriller when I started it. I didn't know that I was writing from the point of view of this man, and I just got very caught up in his way of thinking, and then he wound up being a serial killer. But I guess during COVID, that was my happy place, believe it or not, to go to. And so that's why I started writing a thriller. And then after writing that thriller, I realized that thriller writing is kind of where I'm most comfortable and most interested. And the thriller and mystery community, like Sisters in Crime, and they just are so supportive in ways. And I used to teach writing. I still do for years. I was the head of the Writing Institute at Sarah Lawrence College. So I've been in a lot of writing communities. They're wonderful, but nothing that I felt was as supportive as crime writers and thriller writers in this community is, because they really do seem to be you go to conventions, it's a really wonderful community. So that's how I keep writing, by being around those kind of communities and writing groups and stuff. But how I started writing, I think, is because I wanted to be heard.
I will second that. I thought when I first started writing, it would be very competitive and kind of dog eat dog, kind of snippy, whatever. It was the exact opposite. Everybody wants to help everybody. There's more than enough readers out there for
Yeah.
everyone.
Yeah.
That's the way we looked at it. I'm heavily involved in the 20 books to 50K group that's on Facebook, and it's primarily self-published authors.
Yeah.
And
That's
it's a bunch of people helping each other. And I've given a bunch of presentations to different chapters of the Sisters in Crime.
Oh, great.
And
That's
they're so nice. Oh my
yeah,
gosh.
they really are supportive.
They are. I
Hmm.
There's this
definitely.
I mean, I used
Pat,
to.
are you thinking what I'm thinking?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's this whole expression that you hear about the med school. You look to your right, you look to your left. Well, one of you is not going to be there. So when I teach writing classes, and I got this from a writing mentor of mine, you look to your right, you look to your left. If you're all writing, that's success.
Yes.
That's
Absolutely.
yeah, 'cause we really need to bring each other up, especially because it's hard. I mean, you don't do this alone, so
Correct.
it makes a big difference.
Yeah, I
Absolutely.
think we've all had the same experience. It is a very supportive community. I was surprised by that as well.
Yeah, because it's such a brutal industry.
No,
It is a brutal
It really
industry.
is. Yes, it is. Yeah, you
Yes.
have to have a hard shell, but
Yeah.
the people that are in this community for the most part are just so supportive and so nice. And I don't have a bad thing to say about almost any of them. I mean,
Yeah.
just super, super cool.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
sometimes our shells, we have to be hard, but sometimes they're going to be really cracked or weak. And if you have the right people around supporting you, then you get up and you write the next day,
Yeah,
Right.
absolutely. Absolutely. So Wendy, I'm going to go over to you.
Okay.
And I'm going to read something that was a blurb for your book. There's nothing better than another novel that enhances the excitement created by author Wendy Whitman in the sequel to her debut crime thriller, Premonition. Retribution carries the day as a powerful continuation of the characters of the previous book, filled with new intrigue and adventures of crime and mystery. Once again, Whitman has drawn the reader into another riveting adventure. Gerald P. Boyle, Jeffrey Dahmer's attorney. Now that doesn't happen every day.
Yeah, yeah.
That's creepy.
Now, how did you feel when you first saw that?
Well, Jerry's an incredibly good friend of mine, and
Yep.
he's the greatest guy in the world. He's also in Wisconsin, as you probably
He
know.
sure is. Yep.
And I just love him to death, and he's just an incredible guy all around. If you ever see him, I only saw him in person in a courtroom once, for one of his cases that we covered, and the way he mesmerizes a jury, I've never seen anything like
Oh
it.
yeah.
So I
Yep.
mean, he could get anyone convicted or off. He's a defense attorney. Obviously, he was a defense attorney at the end of his career, but he could get anybody off. He's just amazing. But no, it was a great honor. I put a blurb, a tear from his blurb on the front of Retribution, because he's been such a good friend to me. So that's there.
Absolutely.
But he's just an amazing guy, and as much as we were just commending the Sisters in Crime and the thriller community, I would say the same about Court TV. It was just, especially for television, was just an unusually supportive place. And obviously I met Jerry when I was working there, because we covered a bunch of his cases after Dahmer. We covered Dahmer, but I wasn't there yet. So it was just a great experience getting to know him, and I still consider him one of my best friends, and he's a wonderful person.
Yeah, being in law enforcement for 25 years, it's an adversarial role with public defenders or defense attorneys in general. And, I remember, guys would, poo-poo on them, and I'm like, hey, you never know when you might need one.
Yeah,
So,
exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
when I was on the stand, I remember one time I was on the stand just getting lambasted in a real high profile murder trial. And when all the smoke was clear and I testified for about 2 hours, and I was sweating. I was literally, I mean, I didn't do anything wrong,
No.
but I was just like,
No.
man, this is, there's cameras everywhere. I mean, it was nerve wracking, and I was a fairly new cop, and I'm like, okay, this sucks. And I finally get done. I'm like, okay, that's cool. I'm in the hallway, and I know I don't have to say anything anymore. And the defense attorney was walking down the hall, and I'm just like, hey, I said, you remind me of Columbo. And he said, what? He said, yeah. I said, you're really good. I said, if I ever get into a jam, you're my guy. Yeah. So
And-
never poo-poo that defense attorneys too much.
No.
They're doing their jobs.
Yeah.
So Wendy, let's go back in time a little bit. You know, you have such an interesting and varied background. You were an assistant for Lily Tomlin, George Carlin, and I love both of them. That's why, it like triggered something in my head when we were talking about it before. Then off to law school, court TV, now writing. Looking back on all of that, what was your favorite part of all that? Or do you have a favorite part, or like some fond moments of memories of that?
I guess of each part of my life, I have fond memories. I think when I worked for Lily, I was right out of college, and I just met so many, like, super famous people like Gregory Peck and like rock, like the real like high level people. So,
Yeah.
but after you meet a few of them, you're not very impressed, or you don't. It's not that like once you're just around people, you don't really. It's more the anticipation of meeting someone once you hang out with them or meet them. There's just a person at the end of the day. But at the time, it was a very fun experience and all
Sure.
that. Um, and then Core TV was just an amazing place to work. We would have all stayed there till we were 100, but they blew us all up. But it was a really great place to work. It really was. So
Yeah.
I would think, and George was wonderful, and I was very friendly. His wife was a very close friend of mine, and all that. So we were like a little family. So all those different pieces. Um, I think like when people ask if they're in a book, when you wrote a book, or if they say, "Oh, I'm that character, I'm this or that." Maybe I'm going off topic here a little bit, but I think it's that when you write, you're just automatically drawing from your entire lifetime's
Sure.
experience. So things would, as I wrote, I realized things would pop in my head from years ago, or different pieces of things that you start to meld together. And at the end of the day, a book is an accumulation of your experiences, one way or the other. Even if you're making up the whole story and the characters and all of it, you're still drawing on your life. So I think even things that George said to me and incidents with Lily, a lot of the stuff Lily, she used to make notes whenever we'd go out after the show. She'd drag us all out after the show. We'd all be tired, but she, was all revved up. So we'd always go, and she would always be making notes on napkins, and
Yeah.
she never turned it off. And George was the same way. He was always in his little head. And, I used to hang out in his bedroom with his wife. We'd just be watching TV and stuff, and he'd be in and out, like in his little head, like thinking of routines. And I think these people, people throw around the word genius very loosely, but I think George and Lily, George was and Lily
Or,
is, they really
yeah.
are comic geniuses. And everyone who knows I work for both of them says, wow, because they really are. Like when you see them up close, the way their minds work and the way they came up with their routines, they were amazing. But I think that did, even though I wrote thrillers and nothing to do with comedy, I never wrote comedy for them. I never wrote for them. A lot of people think I went from writing comedy. I never wrote for them.
Oh, okay.
That it was it did affect my writing though. Remembering how they approached their craft, even though it was a different,
Sure.
totally different genre.
So, how difficult was it from covering serial killers and other murders to making up stories about them?
I think it made it much easier because I understand. I don't want to be like arrogant about it, but I think if you cover crime for 20 years, I think you do start to understand how these guys think, whether it's a woman or a man. Obviously, the way fewer serial Eileen Warner's is the only female serial killer in the United States I can think of. There probably could be more. I think you start to think how you start to get how they think and what motivates them and their personality. So I think as I wrote my serial killer, and the second book, Retribution, is from his perspective. Um, you do understand how they think, and as I've said in other interviews, there's one scene where he's killing this girl, and I didn't really plan out how he was going to kill her, but as I was writing it, I understood what he was going to do, and I think we've been talking about, if you create a strong character, you start to know the character, and then the character sort of
Sure.
takes the book where it's supposed to go, and that one scene definitely was like that for me. And when I was done writing, I thought, whoa, like he just wrote that scene. Like I got to know him well enough that I understood what he was going to do. But I think that, and Jerry's told me, going back to Jerry, a ton of intimate stories of his time with Dahmer that I don't think I'm really allowed to repeat a lot of them.
Sure.
But so that did inform me as well, because some of the interactions he had with him and the things Dahmer said to him and what registered with him and didn't register with him is really interesting. So that did help me get some insight into the way these people think.
Absolutely. Now, the Deer Killer series, Premonition and Retribution, can you give us just a sneak peek into the series and why you wrote these books?
Well, I think the first book was sort of like therapy. I knew that I had all these years of experience, and I felt it was sort of like a tribute to the victims. But I came up with a fictional story where the protagonist is loosely based on myself, a very paranoid woman who always thought she was going to be murdered, and that drew her into her career covering crime. And then she stumbles on a serial killer, And it goes from there, and she enlists the help of two of her friends, and they try to track the killer. So that's the general thing. The first book is from her perspective. The second book is from the killer's perspective, and it's filled with more twists and turns and pretty much a lot of nonstop action and all that. I like the way I ended both books. I think they were sort of surprise endings, which I think is sort of good. And
Yes.
I am working on the third book. I'm not 100% committed to necessarily making it a trilogy, but I did start writing it. So I'll see if I can take it in an interesting direction.
There you go. Now, did writing these books dig up difficult memories for you that were kind of suppressed of real murders that you covered when on TV? And how did you deal with that?
I dealt with it by putting bits of those cases in the book. So
Mm,
even though the books are fiction, again, I keep repeating the same cases in interviews, but the murder of Shannon Christian and Christopher Newsom in Knoxville, Tennessee, which was one of the worst murders that's ever been committed in this country that the media barely covered, and any little coverage it got is because I fought for it so hard at Court TV and also with Nancy a little bit. We did a really amazing show on it with her father,
mm,
and then the Carr brothers case in Wichita, Kansas. So those are the two main cases, but also there were specific victims like Tracy Palace was Danny Rolling, if you know Danny Rolling, the Gainesville murders in Gainesville, Florida, the college students. She was his last victim, and there was a picture of her staring into the camera that just has always haunted me because she had no idea what kind of death she was going to have. And I think those are the things I put in the book. And there's so many other cases. I put about 20 different cases in the book,
gotcha.
in the first book and some in the second book, all from the protagonist's thoughts and all that. So I think it worked well, and it was therapeutic for me to do it.
Yeah, because what people don't realize, I mean, what you did for over 20 years, you're getting beaten over the head with the worst of the worst.
Right.
You're seeing it in graphic detail. If you've never sat in a trial, there's all kinds of pictures and video and firsthand, witness statements of just how horrible people can be to other people, and for 20 years, that's a lot. And then you walk away from it, then you start writing a book, and it doesn't necessarily have to be about a specific case, but those memories do come back, even like in your dreams. And, sometimes people have a hard time with that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I tried to show in both books as well the effect it has on producers covering these cases, because you can separate yourself from it. The what we saw, and it's just incomprehensible how people can behave like this. And the way like Shannon Christian, she really suffered. She had one miserable death,
Mm,
and people her parents, her father is just the most heartbreaking person I've ever dealt with in my life. It's just awful,
y-
and that's why I feel like I'm a big death penalty proponent. So
sure.
that's
It's interesting because when I interviewed you before, we talked about gallows humor. People that are,
right.
around that all the time, cops, first responders, doctors, even, and, nurses and firefighters. And, I was being interviewed on a show, and I was talking about all these different homicides, and I saw some of the remarks, and it's like, that guy's such an asshole. He's
Mm.
laughing about people dying, and et cetera, et cetera. And I'm like, I'm not celebrating the fact that somebody died in some gruesome, horrible way, but that's how we had to deal with it. If we cried every time, we'd be basket cases, and we'd be no good for anybody.
Yeah.
So it just but yeah, you
Yeah, so
gotta,
we use black humor at Court TV,
yes,
to lighten things up at times because it became too much.
yeah, you have to. So the book is a serial killer book. What elements do you think are important to build a good serial killer book?
I think obviously you have to have I think it's important to have a good backstory that connects some of the characters. I think the plot has to move forward in a somewhat logical, though surprising direction. The killer himself has to be I think I knew how to craft a serial killer because of my experience. So I feel like I did a realistic kind of job for a serial killer. And we always are saying Pat it because Pat does serial killer stuff too, that serial killers can be, people always expect killers to be weird or homely or obviously off, and that's not true. A lot of them are very charming. You have the Ted Bundy,
Yep.
Scott Peterson. Well, he wasn't a serial killer, but a murderer. That Carrie Stainer, those awful Yosemite murders. A lot of them are extremely good looking, and that's how they get their victims. The Ann Arbor killer years ago, he would go up to girls and say, "What do you think? I'm the killer," and then he'd get them and he'd kill them. So it's like I think a lot of them do have this a charming, side to them and all that, and that facilitates their evilness.
I agree. All right, let's go over to Debbie. Debbie, your book, The Crate. I'm going to read a blurb. The Crate is an impressive and important piece of work. I'm glad it was written, and I'm glad that I read it. And Lee Child wrote that. Wow. That is so cool. Where were you and what were you doing when you found out that Lee Child wrote a blurb for you?
It was one of the highlights of my life, I will tell you, as a
That's
writer.
so cool. Yeah.
So there is a conference of thriller writers called Thriller Fest,
Oh, yeah,
held
New
in
York.
New York City. Yeah, every year. And when my book first came out in 2018, I attended my first Thriller Fest. And I think it was right after the book's release, and it might actually have been the first time I saw my book on a shelf. And, the bookstore at the conference was run by Mysterious Bookshop in New York City.
Okay.
And I was on a panel, and I had just finished speaking on the panel, standing around with a bunch of people from the panel and from the audience, and sort of going over our remarks. And I got a tap on my shoulder, and I turned around and I looked up and I looked up and up. And I'm pretty tall. I'm 5'8", but I
Okay.
had to look way up to meet the person's eyes, and it was Lee Child. And I don't know, whatever he is, 8 feet tall. He was holding a copy of my book. And he said, I'm liking it. I started it last night and I'm liking it.
Wow.
And my jaw just dropped, to the floor. And I couldn't even make a coherent response.
I mean, something like that,
And
that's not solicited and just out of the blue. How cool is that? I mean,
it
really.
was so cool. So cool. Anyway, I found out a few weeks after that he was speaking at Mysterious Bookshop. And even though I couldn't make it to the event by then, excuse me, I had sort of cultivated a bit of a friendship with one of the guys that worked there. And I called up and I said, hey, I know Lee is speaking. Is there any way you could pass a message on to him? And I said, I'm the one that wrote this book. And if you finished it, I'm wondering if you could blurb it. And he agreed. He actually sent a much longer blurb, and we just took a little excerpt from it.
Yeah.
But it was really nice.
Oh, that's awesome. So The Crate, it's a story of war, murder, and justice. Can you give us a sneak peek into the book and why you wrote this?
Yeah. So, I mean, as I said, it's a story that I never expected to write because it really is about a very gruesome murder that involved my family. And it started with a phone call in 2010 where my brother called me up. I happened to be in Florida with my family, and he said from his home in Toronto, he said, there's been a murder. He discovered a wooden crate underneath our family cottage. So now a cottage is a real Toronto phenomena, maybe even a whole Canadian phenomena thing. So I grew up in Canada. And
Okay.
back in the 70s, my parents built this cottage, which was a little lakeside cabin in a very secluded, very majestic area about 2 hours north of Toronto called Muskoka. And back then in the early 70s, this was a real trend for all people from Toronto to be buying and building cottages up north, as we used to say,
Sure.
to escape the city on a summer weekend. And so my parents were building this place, and it became for them a real refuge, a real safe haven. And for me, a pivotal part of growing up every single summer of my life from the age of 7 onwards, and I still do, cherish the place. And that's where my brother found this wooden crate. It was sort of shoved up underneath the floor of the cottage, between the ground and the floor, in this empty space where we just kind of threw tools and wood for fires and stuff like that. And when that crate was opened, it was, horrifying. It was the most grisly thing you could ever imagine, and it turned my family upside down. My brother became a murder suspect in an investigation, and my husband and I were completely freaked out. We had 3 fairly young children that we wanted to protect from the
Sure.
violence of the whole situation. And my parents, who were in their 80s already by then, were traumatized because they never expected to have to confront this kind of human evil right on the doorstep of the one place in the world they felt the safest, because both my parents survived the Holocaust and had come to Canada as refugees, from fascism and then communism. And so they were absolutely traumatized that this had happened in their sanctuary.
Wow.
And
I mean,
so, I was very much caught up in my own head when the whole thing happened. How does this affect me and my family?
right.
And it wasn't until the autopsy revealed who the victim was that I started thinking, oh, okay, wait a minute, there's actually a real victim. We're not the victims. There's a real victim involved here, and
Mhm.
who has a family who is, grieving. And I started thinking maybe I could give this victim a voice. It was before the Me Too movement, and clearly the victim couldn't speak for herself. And I started thinking, with my writing background, maybe I could be her voice.
Wow.
And then as I started writing, it occurred to me that I really needed for the reader to understand my family context, that is Holocaust history, to understand what an impact this crime had on us. And I started thinking I could tell my parents and relatives Holocaust stories at the same time. So it became this sort of braided narrative of what happened with this murder that involved us, and then with my parents and all the relatives that perished, and then a bit of a memoir too.
Now, the Holocaust is such an important piece of global history. How daunting was this as a writer to pay tribute to the victims and their memories while you're writing this? I mean, you want to get it, perfect.
I did. So I did want to pay tribute to the murder victim, but increasingly more and more to my parents, and to honor their stories and my
Sure.
family's stories. Excuse me. And that's really been my motivation since the book came out for doing a lot of speaking about the Holocaust too. That is to honor the victims, and honor the victim of the crime, and then in my next book, honor the victim of that situation, and then in speaking engagements, honor victims of violence in general. So, I mean, we're at a place right now where, unfortunately, not all victims of violence are being believed. Despite this Me Too movement, despite feminism, despite a global push to believe all victims, we're seeing in front of our eyes that that's not necessarily the case for everyone. But it was really important for me to get it right in terms of the Holocaust. So I tried very much to stick to the letter of what my parents told me, what they gave as their testimonies, and exactly what they told me in their own words. And I wanted to be able to call it nonfiction. I wanted to say this is true crime. It's not embellished in any
Right.
way. So I really tried to stick to their words. And looking back, if I had given myself that sort of literary license to make it fiction and to add more, it could have been a broader book in terms of Holocaust history.
Mhm.
But I really wanted to stick to just my parents' stories and what they told me.
Yeah, that's a lot of weight on your shoulders to make sure that it's told right. I mean, how did you deal with that kind of pressure?
I mean, I've learned an awful lot since then.
Okay.
And I really didn't know that much going in when I started writing. It was a real learning process. And so, looking back, I could have done things differently now that I know more. But as I said, I really wanted to stick to what my parents told
Yeah.
me and not exaggerate. So, so I told their stories. I was very fortunate in that my parents both decided to participate in the Steven Spielberg um, Foundation testimonies. I don't know if you know about that whole
Oh.
archive. So
Mm-mm.
back when Steven Spielberg was doing Schindler's List in the 90s, it occurred to him, as a Jew himself, that had he been born at a different time, he might very well be one of the victims that
Yeah.
he was making this movie about. And so he decided to create this massive archive of witness testimonies and survivor testimonies. And it became something like 50, 60,000 testimonies on videotape that they archived in California. And since then, it's all been digitized. But I remember back in the 90s, in the mid 90s, there were all these video crews that were going to, every corner of the globe looking for survivor testimonies and witness testimonies. And they came to Toronto, where my parents were living. There was an ad in the newspaper that said, if you're interested in giving your testimony, we'll make arrangements. And so
Yes.
sure enough, video crew showed up in my parents'
wow.
living
Okay.
room and took their testimonies, which is really crazy because they had never talked about their experiences before that. So when I learned what my parents went through, it was from watching these videos.
Wow. That's amazing. Some of the words that are being used to describe your book was gut punch, emotional, and overwhelming. What kind of emotional toll did this take on you personally while you're writing this book, and how did you deal with it?
Well, first of all, I wasn't a victim in any way. So I hate to say, there was any kind of toll or suffering or anything like that in the process of writing, because everything is relative,
Yeah,
when I
but
know what my parents
you're
went
gonna
through.
right. I'm not trying to dismiss what other people have gone through or your relatives, but being, their child, nobody wants to see a loved one in
Well,
pain
that
or
was,
hurting, and
yeah,
that would
that
be
was the hard part.
that'd be tough. How did you deal with something like that?
That really was the hard part. Watching
Yeah.
the videos with all this emotion that
Oh.
and all the trauma that they went through that they were now expressing for the first time was really tough. And it was also the first time in my life that I really started to identify as a child of Holocaust survivors, because that was never really at the forefront of my identity before. Now it is.
Yeah, and as far as the Holocaust goes, that's something that I don't think is taught or brought up enough. In schools, colleges, especially it's like it's, I graduated from college in 88. I'm an old guy. And I don't think it was barely even talked about back then. And now I know it's not.
Right.
And, we have
I
to,
didn't have any formal Holocaust education,
yeah,
and neither did my kids.
yeah, just, oh,
Yeah.
absolutely.
I think there are only 17 or 18 states right now that mandate Holocaust education. And even then, it's really up to the teachers, what they want to do and how they want to approach it. It's not a set
Right.
curriculum.
That's so sad. But hopefully it will change. And writing books like this hopefully will change that as well. You're bringing awareness. So good for you. For me personally, I mean, I really didn't, I was a World War II buff. So obviously, I knew what was going on, watched movies, read books. But one of my lieutenants on the job, we're just, it's 3 o'clock in the morning. We're just shooting the breeze. And we're talking about grandparents. He said, well, Hitler took care of my grandparents. I'm like, what? He says, yeah, they both died in concentration camps. And I'm like, my jaws just hit the ground. I'm like, it's one thing to, see it on TV or a movie or whatever, but then you're face to face with something, you see the pain, he was robbed of that. And that's very emotional. And I can't even imagine what you went through with all this too. That's wow. So how do you follow up a book like this? What does that look like?
Well, so I wrote another book, but this time I made it a novel, which for me was actually easier to create this fictional world, but it was still based on true crimes. So I wrote A Nest of Snakes, which is about physical and sexual abuse at elite Connecticut private schools, again, based on true events.
Sure.
But for the same reason, which was really to honor the victims, to tell the stories, maybe be a catalyst for someone to come forward and talk about what they experienced.
Good. Now, what's your advice for anyone who's going to write a book about the Holocaust or something, along those lines?
Well, like you said, get it right.
Yes.
There are a lot of books out there that have sort of a related Holocaust theme, and I call them Holocaust light, in that they really don't get into the horrors of what really happened. And it's interesting because I heard from from teachers that there's another version of the Diary of Anne Frank that many schools use that
Oh,
has a happy ending.
come on.
Yeah.
Really? Oh, I
Uh-huh.
never, oh.
That's
And
that's
so
horrible.
I've never seen this. I've only heard about it, so it's sort of secondhand, but I don't think we're doing any favors to the next generation by
No.
sugarcoating it that way.
If
I
I can
know you
just
have to walk a
interject-
fine line.
If I can just interject quickly,
Sure.
because I'm Jewish myself as well. There's a shockingly small percent of like kids between the ages of like 18 and 30 that even have heard of the Holocaust.
Yeah.
And just quickly also, when I was at Court TV, the APs who worked for me, PAs and APs who were all in their 20s, almost none of them had heard about Kent State in this country. So there's a huge problem with knowledge, whether it's relatively more recent, because Kent State was obviously more recent, but it's just a big red flag what's actually going on.
Yeah, I totally agree.
Yeah, I
The other
think,
problem with the Holocaust, though, is active denial. I mean, that's a
Yes,
whole other
that's a whole other
phenomena.
thing.
It's
Yeah.
not just ignorance, it's active denial.
Yeah.
So
Oh God.
we have a real agenda of
Yes.
rewriting history these days.
Yep.
Yes,
I
we
think we
certainly
always
do.
have, yeah.
Yeah.
Rewriting history just seems to be part of what we do.
God, it's
Sad.
terrible.
Yeah.
All right, TM, your
Mhm.
book, Her Father's Daughter. Now, Gumshoe Review, their blurb was like Norman Bates of Alfred Hitchcock's classic Psycho, Anthony Donovan is a fictional serial killer that I won't soon forget. Neither will I soon forget the disturbing horrors of T.M. Dunn's serial killer masterpiece, Her Father's Daughter. Hearing that description of your book, how does that make you feel?
Like, I don't know what to say. I wondered who this person was and who paid them to say it. I mean, like, I'm Hitchcock. What some, I mean, it's like I was just really, overwhelmed. But it just made me feel great that well, of course, that they said this, but that they saw the connection. Because in writing the serial killer, I wanted the character who I didn't set out to be a serial killer, but just to be complex. And I think that in a lot of ways, Norman Bates is very complex, and and he's someone you analyze and all that kind of stuff. Anyway, so it felt surprising, and I don't think that I'm anywhere near, Hitchcock's level, but maybe someday. Somebody once said compared my writing to Stephen King, which blew me away. I was
Ooh,
like,
that's
oh, if
good.
only. Yeah, no, it was great.
I'd
But
take that, yeah.
yeah, I take that. Then of course, there's a lot of those negative reviews, but I try not to pay too much attention to them. Well, I actually let them make me miserable for a while and then I move on. But anyway, yeah. It
So
was
can
nice.
you give us a sneak peek into your book, Her Father's Daughter, and why you wrote it?
So it's interesting, I had two other books out. I've never thought about writing a thriller, or even, I mean, I watched a lot of thrillers. I'm a fan of thrillers, but never even thought about it. And I started writing in this character's voice, and I was actually writing a lot of it during COVID, right? So I was only in this father's head. I didn't even know he was a father. It was this man who was basically telling this love story of how he met, his wife, and then various things that go on. And then as I was writing it, and it was, like I said, it was during COVID, so it was my happy place to go and write about this character who turns out to be a serial killer. And as I was writing him, there's different aspects that I write a lot about exterminators. My dad was an exterminator, and I know a lot about that business. And I'm always very curious because there's something about being an exterminator where you really meet all different types of people. So that was fascinating. But I also had a child actor as a brother, and my father was kind of a stage father. So a lot of those aspects kind of make up the father's personality. He didn't become a father, or didn't know that until I started writing the other point of view, which is the daughter. And she was harder than him. I can get into his head very easily, but she was a little bit harder. So why I wrote it, because I was really interested in just where this voice, I'm like one of these people that just write and then see where it goes. I get I'm a little bit more, let me get some idea, but that's just kind of where I went with this book. And I kind of fell in love with the character and the story, but what I really was very much cared about, it was important to me, was one of my favorite characters of all time. People hear me say this all the time, is Hannibal Lecter, because I
Okay.
was always very, very curious by how the author gets you to kind of almost empathize. Well, maybe that says a lot about me, but with a character who eats people's faces, but you really you kind of root for him at times, right? And I've also, that's kind of why I started writing this story, but I also think in the back of my mind was my obsession with serial killers. When I was 12 years old, I like to say this, it was the summer I went through puberty. Some people may know it as the Summer of Sam. And there was a David Berkowitz,
Oh, yeah.
45 caliber killer. They called him various names, but he killed my friend's cousin around the corner of my block. So the people that he killed, and there weren't actually as many as some of these serial killers we hear about. He killed a total of 6 people, and in Queens and in my neighborhood, which basically turned the whole world that I was in upside down.
Sure.
They thought that he was like going after women with long blonde, oh no, long dark hair. And so
Yep.
everybody was cutting their hair and doing all this stuff. Anyway, he also turned out to be my aunt's post person. And then years later, he turned out to be the neighbor. He lived with his adopted parents, which, by the way, his parents were treated him very well. So that wasn't his connection to why he became that way. But my husband's aunt and uncle gave him a puppy. They lived in a place called Co-op City, and the building wouldn't let him keep it because it was a no pet law. So that poor couple believed for so many years it was their fault that he became a serial killer, which really the dog in the whole myth, it was a mythical story, which he'll even talk about in his interviews, he talks about. So it wasn't really based on a real dog. But anyway, I got very curious with serial killers and then read a lot of books. I mean, I remember reading Helter Skelter when I shouldn't have been reading it, but it was in the house because I think my
Sure.
mother liked the cover when I was like 10, so I got very curious about serial killers. And at the time, there wasn't even the name serial killers. They didn't coin that until later. And then I just started reading more books about them. I listened to every podcast that there is. And so I was just very curious about the complexities of different people and how some serial killers, like the particular this one, I still believe that they can be, loving fathers and do these good things and do these atrocious, horrific acts in another part of their mind or world. And my particular character doesn't really see what he's doing as wrong. You have to kind of read the book to understand that.
Right.
But at the heart of it is really a father-daughter relationship. My dad had passed away while I was writing the book, and there's just a lot of stuff that came out.
Mm.
So I worked through a lot of that stuff in this book too. So yeah.
Yeah, I was lucky enough to interview the psychotherapist who spent 100 hours with David Berkowitz
Wow.
in prison. And he wrote a book about it. It's called Monster
Oh, yeah.
Lair.
Yes. Yeah.
So I interviewed him. It was eye-opening. I was just like, wow, okay. And again, when it comes to serial killers, there isn't a type anymore. We would always think, oh, it's that loner that's kind of like ugly and this, that, and the other thing. And it's like, no, the more they dig into it, the more they're finding out that
Well, I mean, yeah,
it could be
exactly.
your neighbor.
No, I mean, but it often is. I mean, everyone thinks that there's this, because it makes sense. We all want to have like a type so we could figure it out.
Right.
There's always going to be someone that breaks that. It used to be only men, but there are women. There may be more men, but and all the reasons why are varied. Not everyone, most, but not everyone has a bad childhood, or was abused. I mean, it's very interesting why people become serial killers now. Everyone's looking at brain patterns. And there's something true to the fact that a lot of serial killers have a similar brain pattern, whether it's because they were born with it or brain, makeup. But then one of the people, the scientist I remember, and I wish I could remember his name, that was doing the experiment, he was looking at all of these like brain pattern waves or parts, I'm sorry, X-rays, whatever, MRIs, and saying, yes, serial killer, serial killer, serial killer. And then they put his thing in front of him and he said, definitely. And they said, well, that's your brain. So the question then was, it like nature versus nurture? I mean, it's very complicated, But
like I said before, I think the more they dig into it, the more they don't know. You know,
yeah,
there's FBI profilers and all this. A big chunk of that is malarkey, I think. You know,
yeah,
it's just the way that it is.
they're
And
trying to make sense of something. But I do,
correct.
but in the world we live in now, which is so crazy, in so many ways, maybe, and it's, I guess, maybe always been, there's something about as irrational and undefinable as a serial killer may be, well, especially when you're writing fiction, it seems to make more sense in that world than the rest of the things that were happening
Yeah.
in the world.
So
So
now you teach creative writing. Now,
yeah.
how difficult was it to write this book, knowing that your students and peers were going to read it? Was that extra pressure on you?
Well, I would, I've been like teaching and coaching for over 20 years.
Yeah,
So there's always that pressure of people reading your work. But
sure.
writing about this particular subject, the only thing that I think that felt pressure once it became the category of like thriller was I wanted to make sure that I was actually writing a thriller. But I don't think it was extra pressure in any other way that anything else I've written. It's the
Okay.
same thing that, you're worrying about what people think, trying to not worry about what people think, thinking like I can't do it, all those things that, we writers beat ourselves up about. That was actually, it's probably less with this book because I really got so absorbed with the character
Mm,
that I was able to put a lot of my negative speak
yeah.
behind.
Well,
Yeah.
it takes a lot of guts to hit that publish button. You know, you're putting yourself out there. It's like standing in front with like a sandwich board on you or something. You know, it's like you're literally just opening yourself up to everything,
Yeah, I
every
mean,
kind of
it's hard.
criticism.
Yeah,
Yeah, it is.
it is really hard, but I do believe, and I've worked on conferences, I work with agents and publishers, and the thing is, there used to be this idea, like when I was in graduate school, that talent was what mattered. Now, I think that talent is like, can be a lot of, like you said, malarkey, because it's
Yeah.
just very amorphous. But really, and I, in my early days of like, my MFA program, some of the most talented people just stop writing. So the big T that we should be really thinking about is tenacity.
Mm,
And you can stick with it. There are a million ways you can get published. Now, whether you're going to make the big bucks or not is a whole other story, but you can
right.
get published, but you can't do it alone. And that's what I tell people all the time. Your books, you need writing groups, but support groups. You want to be around people that get you and get your work so that they can help you with the hard days and they can help you with the emotional stuff going in your life. But when you really feel like I'm never going to write again, you want somebody who's going to say, sure. And then the next day they're going to say, get out of bed,
Sure.
start writing.
Absolutely.
Because I think those kind of systems and support, I mean, I know I've been with the same writing group for 25 years, and we all started off not published, and now we all published. But there have been days where if that group wasn't there, I don't know if I could have kept going, because the rejection does hurt. And
Does.
I've so many people get rejected a few times and just give up on their great stories that they really need to write, and that's why they wrote them, and to just stop there. And I understand why, because you almost got to be kind of a little out of your mind to even like welcome all of the rejection, because that's what's going to happen. But I think just having groups, even like being around people like Wendy and Deborah, and and just having people like you that do these podcasts to talk to writers and try to understand why we do what we do, really makes a difference.
Cool. Now, as a teacher and a coach for writers, what are some of the most like common mistakes you see rookie or maybe not so rookie writers make with their books? And you can be specific with thrillers or, serial
Actually, well,
killers.
I'm right now teaching, I work with something called, well, an organization called Key to the Castle Workshop. And we started off by doing workshops in Italy. We still do them.
Mm,
And we're going to Quebec. We take people to on different parts of the world, and then we started doing more domestic. And so, and I've been doing a lot of classes. So I'm doing a class now with them, and I co-teach it with a wonderful author and teacher, kind of my mentor, even though we went to school at the same time, Alexander Soisis. And we teach a class called 10 to the End. And we have 10 students, and in 10 months, they will write their full books. And the reason why we
oh,
know
cool.
that is because to get them to do that is not just about teaching them craft, it's also about creating an environment. We meet with them one-on-one every other week. We really do all the things to help them get the support. And a lot of it is teaching them craft is one thing, but it's really helping them on the psychological and the emotional level. And so I think the biggest thing that any writer makes, the biggest mistake, is listening to that voice and letting that voice tell you that you can't do it, take over. So
Imposter syndrome.
Yep,
yeah, and you
absolutely.
can't, yeah, but you can't shut that down, I believe, just by the more you think, the more you're going to just get into that kind of circle. So this is not for me. I got this from other people, but they call it different names, but I call it a dump page. And while you're writing, when that voice starts talking, write down what the voice is saying. And before you know it, you'll get more tired of writing all those negative things and be able to move back to your work than you will if you just let it like just swim around your head. So I think giving into that, I think that in terms of the actual writing, the biggest mistake I think a lot of writers make is they're not, well, one, sharing this stuff in a way where they're workshopping it too soon. Because even if you get, I've heard student writers that have written wonderful stuff, got great feedback, and that stopped them because they felt like, how could I keep up with that? So that stopped them. And then there's the negative feedback or the feedback from, people getting especially with novels, or full books, they're only reading a partial, and then they're giving you all these opinions, and you start writing to the one person that's never going to read your book anyway. And then all the other stuff that's positive you don't hear. So workshopping too soon can be dangerous, but also not sharing your work when you have questions with people that you do trust, and finding that trusted reader that kind of wants to help you get to where you want to go, not write your book for you, is really important, because I see too many people trust their wrong instincts. Like I'll tell everyone, trust your instincts. When it comes to our writers, I say, don't trust your instincts. It's because some of our best stuff, like Stephen King, Carrie, he threw in a waste
Yeah,
paper.
threw it in the garbage. Yeah.
And it was his wife that pulled it out, right? So our best stuff we think is crap, whatever, either because it came too easy or we didn't feel connected. And then some of our not so great stuff we think is wonderful. And it's not always that way. So I really think that not sharing your work at all, but you got to find the right person or people that you can trust that's going to read it for you. So the actual mistakes is more to do around the writing than the writing itself. And I also think, and even though I struggle with this all the time, is thinking that you got to wait for some inspirational moment, or that there's going to be a right time, and I'm still struggling with this now. I mean, I just all the time, there's all these other things that are going to be more important than that writing. And if you just take 10 minutes a day, you could sit on the toilet with a notebook and a pen, you will be surprised at how much you will accomplish. But waiting for inspiration or for that right moment, it's never going to come. If you sit down and you make yourself sit down, or even write standing up, but if you just do it, all that, the fun will be able to happen. Your characters will take off. But we spend so much energy, and I'm talking to myself as well, talking about all the reasons why we can't and how can we actually do this, instead of just saying, well, why don't I just write a page or write a few lines and walk away. So I think the answer to all our questions as writers, which is the hardest answer to hear, is writing.
Yeah, yeah, ass in seat, right?
Yeah.
It's not going to happen if you're not actually doing it.
Yeah, and all your answers to, we novels about like being novel and breaking rules and or making rules. And we set all our rules, whether we know it's consciously or unconsciously, in our first drafts. So until we get through a rough first draft, we really can't start turning our books into what they need to be. Because I know I've done this, we'll spend like years on those first few chapters, and we get to the end and we wind up having to cut them because they weren't needed. So it's tricky how we keep going, but I think moving ahead to that ending of that first draft, because you can write a book in 20 years, but that's going to be a different book. You're a different person. So getting that first draft out and then going back and revising, that's really where you can make all the magic happen.
I
Have
agree.
you ever had a student get published?
I've had many students get published.
Really?
Yeah.
How about from the 10 to the end?
Well, right now, this is the first class that we're doing, but
Okay.
I've been teaching the novel for years, and I've had many, many students, and many of them who I love and care for, but as a writer, I'd be very jealous because they've done very well. So, yeah. So, but yes, I've had many, and it's really because they stuck with it, and and they take feedback, but I think getting people that are going to support you. I mean, I worked for Sarah Lawrence for a long time, and there was that idea that you want to help people focus not on just what they, give them feedback on what they can improve, but you've got to really help people see what they do well, because you can build off that. And that idea, like you see in med school, which I've seen in a lot of writing programs, where you look to your right and you look to your left, and one of you is not going to be there. If you look to your right and you look to your left as a writer, that's better for all of us. Because the more of us that are out there writing, the better it is for all of us. It's not creating competition, it's creating a community. And if we don't support each other, why are we doing it? Because the publishing industry, and I feel worse for the public industry every day, because I just see how they're just barely holding on. But we have to support each other, because if anything, that's all we have.
I agree. All right, I have some questions for whoever wants to answer them. Let's have a little bit of fun here. What's the best advice for writing true crime or thrillers?
I'll jump in and just say, I think, in our cases, we all came across real things, whether it was like Debbie and Pat drawing on the real life, or me drawing on the cases I covered at Court TV and getting involved with the victims and families and the killers and all that.
Yeah.
I think you have to base your writing on something real. If you don't have any experience with it or any knowledge, I don't see how it would come through as an authentic story, thriller, the actual killer, the victim, even the victims, and how they pick their victims, all of it. So I think you need some kind of experience some kind of real life experience, one way or the other, to do it correctly.
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree. I think you really need to get to know the characters and experience. You got to do your research. At the same time, it's not just always going to be like the facts of what happened. It's also going to be, you have to really try to figure out a way to authentically connect to these characters. So you don't have to be a serial killer to get into that mindset.
Yeah,
or,
please don't.
Yeah.
But it helps.
although I have had people,
That's
once
frowned
they,
upon, yes.
yeah, once they knew that my father was an exterminator, they have asked me, "Is your father a serial killer?" And I started saying, "I don't know. Not that I know." And then I've heard people whisper to each other, "I think your father's," and I figured, if you can sell books, let them believe what they want. But I think also with thrillers too, if you think you're going over, like, you got to just keep going. The stakes have to be really high always, right?
Sure.
It's fast paced, and it's got to keep moving. So if you think you kind of like hit that like high point, go higher. You got to kind of almost think soap opera, because you're never going to really like go over the top as much as you think, but you got to keep raising the stakes, and you got to be very clear about what your protagonist wants, and then all the obstacles, including their flaws, will get in the way of those wants and how they have to overcome them. So I think that's a big part of it too, but really raising the stakes
Cool.
as much as you can.
And I think also sensitivity to the victims. I think,
Yes.
it's our opportunity to honor real life victims. And you never know who's reading your book. If they've gone through something very similar, you don't want to be cavalier about the victim's experience. So
No, I think that should be like very important, just as because of the material, and writing does have a lot of power. I do think that we have to be careful about, at least in first drafts, because it's not going out into the world right away, that whatever we're writing, that we're actually, not worrying about right away what people think or what our family thinks or our students. And then going back, and as we read it, yeah, like you said, to think about that sensitivity and how whatever our characters are we really treating them as in the way that they should deserve to be treated? But I think that if censoring ourselves in the beginning could be a little bit difficult. So I think just write what we're going to write, and then make sure that we just get it right and share our work so that people can give us that feedback before we just send it out.
All right, for those who are going the traditional published model, what's the best advice for trying to get an agent or a publisher?
So, all right, I do a lot of publishing conferences. I used to run them, and I've had several agents. So, and I've done a self-published book after the publisher that had bought the book fell apart. And then I've done small press, traditional. I know it all, but I do believe, and I did books without an agent. I do believe having an agent is important, to have somebody that can kind of like fight for you when it needs to be done, right? Like there's things that you don't want to, as a writer, you don't want to be that pain in the ass writer, right? Your agent can do that, right? If your cover isn't wonderful, your agent could fight for you and all that stuff. But how you get an agent, it's both easier and tougher than ever. But I think especially with true crime and thrillers, making a personal connection, and that means going to conferences and, and sometimes that have pitching conferences
Yeah,
that
like
we,
Thriller Fest has Pitch Fest.
yes, and
I-
there's a
yeah.
lot of those kind of things that are out there. Some are online, because making that connection, it's just getting your foot in the door. You can take a publisher's marketplace. You can $25 a month. You don't have to take it for long, but you can. That's the insider to the publishing world, and they list a lot of agents that are going to tell you like what they're looking for. I mean, you got to do a lot of research, and you got to be open to a lot of rejection. But I think that knowing somebody that knows somebody, asking people, looking at the books that you like or that you feel like are familiar as yours, and they always usually people thank their agents. If that's then reaching out to those agents. I mean, it's, and actually when you hit 60, 70 rejections, then you might say, all right, what's going on here? But until you do, don't back off with one or two. Don't like give up in that way. But I do
Yeah.
think that conferences more than ever, especially conferences like Thriller Fest or any of these conferences that are like even Crime Bake does the same thing. That they have people that are focused and looking for these kind of work is going to be your best bet into really making that connection. And no, and
Yeah.
and you got to sell yourself, and it's hard because a lot of us rather we write and we don't feel so comfortable, but we, I mean, we show up, like, and we
Sure.
just have to kind of ask people. And sometimes, look, I feel like if you're going to contact an agent or you see a person and they're going to be obnoxious, you don't want that agent anyway.
Sure.
So, I'm not saying to stalk them, but there's polite stalking, I guess, in a sense. But I do
There's
say that
tenacity, right? There's
but
tenacity.
one thing I will say for a lot of writers is, they get an agent that asks for a partial. Now, first of all, the easiest thing for an agent to say is no, right? Because they don't want to hold you up or them up. So if they see it, they're going to say no, right? If they ask for work and you never hear back from them, follow up. I've had people, they didn't necessarily take it, but I followed up. I even called a person once and she never got it. It went to spam or she never saw it and she read it within 2 days. So I think don't just never take no answer for an answer, because people just assume they weren't interested. And then that's sometimes often not the case, especially if they took the investment to read the whole book. If you didn't hear from them, there's some reason why.
Yeah.
That's not you.
So having just gone through this
And you did
process
it too, yes.
myself, like
Okay.
literally just finished, I can attest to how painful all these rejections are. But I think you have to have an element of faith,
Yeah.
that your book, your manuscript is going to eventually land in the right lap.
Yeah.
And that's not to say you don't do the work. I mean, you have to make the best product that you can, the most polished, and make sure it's as great as it can possibly be before submitting. But then once you start querying, you have to have this element of faith that, if it's meant to be, it's going to land in the right place. And that's, I think, what happened to me. I got enough rejections to make it really brutal, but then landed with a person who's very excited and very enthusiastic. So I think
That's what you want. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah. And
That's the
I'll throw my
process.
2 cents into self-publishing is also an option. And
Yeah, I've done it too.
I see a lot of hybrid
Yep.
authors out there now where there's certain situations where, yeah, it makes sense to be traditionally published, and there's some where it makes a ton of sense to be self-published.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, and actually in some job, I mean, I know people that were, selling their books and making a good deal of money on self-publishing. And then they got a deal with some big house and then left the big house because they felt like they could do a better job.
Oh, yeah.
And so that stuff is true too. And hybrids, if you're with the right one, like Sisters, She Writes, She Writes Press. And I watched them go from, they were editors and agents and they were in the field. And so they will they only take on books that they feel like they can work with someone, right? And they really will make sure that, because if you're going to do it yourself or a hybrid, which is less of a financial commitment, but you want to make sure that you still got to do all the work and make sure it's the right cover. It's got to be really copy edited and line edited and all the things a publisher traditional would do. And so hybrids usually have a lot of those people doing it as well. So that's a good way to do it.
Yes.
Yeah. We just,
Okay.
yeah.
Okay. So let's talk about marketing. Most writers cringe at that word. What works best for you? What do you think is you get your best bang for the buck when it comes to marketing.
I'll just jump in about this. I don't have an agent because I was looking for when I wrote the first book, I was looking for an agent and a publisher at the same time, and I got hooked up with this publisher through a friend of mine who publishes people with and without agents. So he went for the book quickly, and of course I wasn't going to not do it. So, but in retrospect, it's a very huge learning curve when writing the book is one thing, but all that comes afterwards, I think people just don't even begin to understand what they're getting into. So I think that I think the biggest thing that's hurt me personally is not having an agent. And I think that's something I'm going to have to work on as I go forward. Can you repeat your question again? Because I sort of
The
answered the
marketing.
previous
It
one.
was
Oh,
asking
the
about
marketing.
marketing. Yeah.
So I think if you have the right agent, like I feel like I've been mostly the onus has been on me to do all of this, and I don't have any marketing experience and all of that. So of course it's Instagram, Facebook, doing events, doing book. I did the Morristown Festival of Books, so I could rattle off. I did a lot of court TV and different appearances through friends of mine who have shows and radio and all that. But I think and I could be wrong because I've never had an agent, but I think having the right agent might very well help a lot with the marketing and how to sell books. Because
Yeah, well,
I am truly at a loss as to what sells a book. Like I
yeah,
just
so
don't
basically,
even get it.
so my feedback, is like, an agent can be great in helping with that, but it's really the house that you're with. So you
Yeah.
can, and how much resources they have.
Yeah.
First of all, whatever you're doing, you want to make sure there's distribution, because, you can have a great editor, the press and the people could be wonderful, but if they don't have a good way of distributing books, and a lot of times even some of the best, publishers just don't have the marketing resources. So you have to take on, the more you can at least learn and take on. Now, some of the bigger houses that have a bigger budget, and a lot of times you're like, why is this book doing so well? And look what's behind them, right? They got all the advertising budget. There's a lot of stuff they can do for their authors. But whether you're doing it with a big publisher that has more support, or a smaller one, or on your own, you got to be willing to really be very active in the whole process. So that means you don't have to know everything right away, but you want to learn or get people. There are people you can work with. I mean, I know a lot about social media and marketing, but I know enough to know that I have to bring people on to kind of give me that support, because this last year, even with this book, and I've done this for several books, it takes so much out of you that you just can't even begin to write anymore, right? For a while. So you got to know, so social media is great. And there's also, newsletters you can do. There's like events you can do. There's podcasts are great. But I think also figuring out, and I'm working with someone right now that's helping a lot, what's your brand, and how is your brand as a writer getting out there, as opposed to just one book, right? Because there's a lot of other things that are going to be that you're selling, that are going to be bringing people to your books, right? So I do think, though, with what I found, I have had a lot of success that I was surprised, is these booksagrammers. So, I got on a few tours, and these are people that read your book, they love books, what they get for it is the book. And, and those kind of reviews, and going with the right people that can set that up, can get your book out there to the kind of readers that are going to read your book. So all of these things help, but it's a big picture. I mean, if you could get on, like a TV show or in a book, all those kind of stuff, that's going to be great. But sometimes it's all it's basically like, what we used to call guerrilla marketing, all right? It's just, and that's actually showing statistically that's doing the most for all companies. It's not like the big ads. It's all of this like face-to-face, building up your social media. And that's why if authors don't have a social media presence, you should have one before your book comes out, because you want to start building up an audience and a following.
Yeah. Build the buzz. Yeah.
Yeah.
You have to build that author brand.
Yes.
People want, it's like Pat Flynn, wrote a book called Superfans. I'd much rather have 1,000 superfans that will buy whatever I put out there than 10,000 mediocre fans.
They are going to buy it. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, you got to develop that. And the only way that's going to happen is to put yourself out there. There's so many different ways of doing it. And, social media is great, but they can overnight change everything. X can go away tomorrow. Instagram could change their rules.
I
TikTok
wish X
could
would
go.
go away.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah,
like,
well, yeah, but
look
yeah.
at look at TikTok. That's on the verge of it is being banned in certain instances. And if you have an organic newsletter, you have your newsletter, you're in complete control of that. You have your fans, you stay in touch with, and you develop a personal relationship with these fans, and you give things away. And then when it comes to an ask, it's not so abrasive.
No.
You've already
Thank
given
you.
so much. And, it just, again, it circles back to, I've got 100% control over my newsletter. Or if I want to start selling from my website, I have 100% control over that. Whereas if you're on different social media platforms, whatever, they come and they go. So developing that author brand, I think, is huge, and putting yourself out there. And there is a fallacy, I think, with traditional publishing where people think that they're going to do all the work for me.
No, they don't.
No,
No.
they will not.
No.
You got to beat the bushes. You got to put yourself out there.
Yeah.
I have an author friend who said that writing the book is the fun part, but marketing is the hard part.
It
Yeah.
is.
And I think that's so true.
It's
It
true.
totally
It's
Oh,
is.
But yeah.
100%.
I mean, I do a lot of in-person events, like you were saying, Patrick. I think I stopped counting at 250. I do a lot of, and I
Sure.
sell a lot of books at the events because it's that, that interface.
Yeah, but you guys are developing your own author brands. All of you are, and they're unique, and and for a lot of people, it's going to be like, yeah, I can really relate to that person, or I really like that person. There's a face to the book, and that's just being human. That's just the way it is. So I got to ask you guys, how did this alliance of yours start with the three of you? It's so cool because you all get along really well, it seems like, and you complement each other.
Well, we get along really well on, screen or like on podcasts, but no.
It's brutal behind the scenes.
Oh
Yeah, well,
my,
I
oh my.
think, yeah. We met during Sisters in Crime in
Okay.
Connecticut. And I think we did an event. I don't even know how we first did the first event together.
I don't
but-
remember exactly
I don't
what
remember
brought
either.
us together specifically. I was thinking about that the other day. I don't remember
what first-
specifically
Yeah.
how we.
No, I
did the
remember
first
meeting you
event.
both for the first
Yeah, I
time at
remember-
Halloween.
Yes, I remember
Yeah.
that too. Yeah, at Halloween.
And we had
This is-
stuff that, we wrote about things that were connected. We
Yeah.
knew each other, and we thought we were going to just do this one event, and then we did another one and another one. And we weren't even like cult. We didn't even have the name,
Crime Trio.
Crime Trio.
Crime Trio.
But we did come out, and I think this may have been, I don't know if it was Wendy or Deb, they came up with the rip from the headlines idea.
I think Debbie did, right?
Yeah, and so
Yeah.
that was great, and that actually helped us to figure out how we were going to work together, and or talk about our work that was similar, because we are writing about somewhat different things, right?
Did you guys meet like at a conference or like
No, at a
through
Sisters in Crime event in
Yeah,
Connecticut.
well, yeah, and Deb,
Okay.
Halloween
and
party.
Deb and I
think
met
that's when.
before I was even writing thrillers. We were.
Oh, you did? Okay.
We met at the Westport Library. Do you remember that?
Oh, I didn't remember that.
Yeah,
Thank you for reminding me.
Yeah, we met when I was at Westport, where I was
Yeah.
actually
Yeah,
with them a little bit. And there was a conference there, and we met there.
that's
But
right.
then we didn't actually, but it was, maybe 2 years after that, or at least a year, that I joined Sisters in Crime, and that we connected that way. And then Wendy, we met at I think it was at Halloween party for Sisters.
Yeah, at Elise's. Yeah. And Debbie, that's where I met you as well. I remember
Yeah.
the first time, but I just
Yeah.
don't remember specifically how we planned the first event for some reason. I just don't remember. But it really clicked, it really clicked.
Yeah,
I think so.
but this friendship and this like alliance never would have happened if you didn't put yourself out there.
No,
Right.
no, not at all. No.
If you
Well,
weren't,
it's
in
like
an
the
organization-
origins of Charlie's Angels. That's how I think.
Yes, that's why
You're gonna have to do the,
Yeah, be our Charlie.
do.
Patrick could be
Actually,
our Charlie.
one of the
I'll
gra- one of the
I'll be the
graphics we have.
voice. I'll
Yeah,
be the voice.
Yeah.
it's great, but it really, and I think that the few of the events that we've done in person, we'll like argue with each other, especially Wendy and I have very different feelings
Yeah,
about
yeah.
the death penalty, for instance.
And
Yeah.
Hannibal.
Yeah, yeah. So, it's great.
But at the end of the day, we can
It's
all
been
be
fun, a
friends.
lot of fun.
That's the
Yeah.
beautiful thing. Yes.
Yeah.
All right, let's have some fun. When you guys are writing your books, do you ever think of, okay, this main character, Tom Cruise would be a good main character for that.
Yes, I have a main character. Yes, I have that.
Okay, let me know. Go ahead.
So I would love, and I came very close to meet, to somebody meeting him, that whatever, but something happened. I can't go into all the details, but I always thought Mark Ruffalo would be the perfect person for the father of my book. Perfect.
Okay.
Yes, he's got as an actor, a million ways, I think he'd be like perfect. So if anybody wants to introduce me to him or whatever, and I just love him anyway. So, but I was very clear about him.
Okay. How about,
I've got one.
okay, Debbie, go ahead.
So I think I mentioned him from Toronto. And you know who else lived in Toronto for many years? Keanu Reeves.
Oh,
Yeah, that's
Keanu,
right.
yes.
Yeah.
Keanu. And he and I are about the same age. I can completely picture him as the protagonist in A Nest of Snakes, who was the abused boy back in the 80s and is a very disturbed and traumatized middle-aged man in the present.
Yeah, I could see that.
And Keanu, if you're listening to this,
Yes.
I want you to star in my movie. But I actually met him once. He was playing
Really?
Mercutio in Romeo and Juliet. I think he was maybe 24 at the time. I think I was probably the same age watching him, and he was so good.
Yeah.
And so cute.
Was this before or after Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure?
That would have been before.
Before, he was still in
Before.
Toronto before he
Oh,
moved to
okay,
Toronto.
gotcha.
Yeah.
All right.
And George was in Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure with him.
Oh.
So I went to a screening of that. If anyone remembers that movie, it wasn't,
Oh, yeah, of course.
but George, yeah, that was one of George's first movies.
How about you, Wendy? Do you have one?
Yeah, I think for Vito, I was thinking of Jeff Bridges potentially for that, and for Hank's father in the second book, potentially Bryan Cranston. But I'm not like really fixated on any one actor.
Okay.
But you sort of start to visualize them, but it's tricky. And sometimes an unknown will show up. Like if you were actually Soldier, like Soldier book, we should all be so lucky. Sometimes it's good to find an unknown who happens to be what you're really picturing versus someone who like just another Nicole Kidman thing or just another this thing, you know what I mean? So I think there's also pluses to finding someone,
Very good. All right. I've got one question from somebody in my Facebook group, Cops and Writers, Frances Sheldrick. She says, "Oh, I'll need snacks and beverages for this one. I'm interested in the process of having just rewritten several scenes where I had the action and plot line, but belatedly discovered all the little details that make a scene fascinating and exciting. Aside from joining up and spending several years as a detective, is there any way to learn these things before late stage editing? How do you do it? Or how do you rely on beta readers? Thank you in advance."
So learning like the procedural stuff detectives do. Well, I gotta say the Police Academy for Writers was an amazing experience. And even that organization that's really committed to just helping writers get it right, because the people that were police officers and detectives, and couldn't stand how like people in the movies and all that stuff and books just weren't right. But you can also, depending on what you want to know, I mean, joining organizations like Sister in Crime, they have events all the time, like Sisters in Crime Connecticut tomorrow night is going to be doing, and I know this may be dated, but it's going to be doing an in-person with forensic scientists, and they're showing us the procedures of that. I mean, so you can go to your local police station to, what she's interested in learning about in terms, and if she's writing a detective character, just talking to detectives and it's also doing your research, knowing where it's placed. If you're in Stanford, they don't even call, I think they don't call their investigators detectives. They have to call them something else because of some lawsuit. I mean, just knowing where you are, but you could, you don't have to spend years and years, but whatever you're going to be writing about, you just have to do your research, and then just look for the resources. But organizations like Sisters in Crime, Mystery Writers of America, we'll have a lot of events online and in person that you can kind of really talk to the experts. I know Sisters in Crime.
Same with international thriller writers.
Yes, that's right.
They have 3 solid days of panels and workshops, and it's just a
Sure.
wealth of information.
Yeah, yeah, conferences too have a lot of that, so, but you know.
Yeah,
if you-
I've sat on a bunch of conferences, you know, on
Yeah,
panels, on
yeah,
conferences.
panels,
I've
yeah.
run them, and we had a thing called Cop Camp last year. It
Yeah,
was
oh,
very
great.
small. It was
Ooh.
at a police academy in Wisconsin.
Yeah, yeah, well, I
It was
went to.
just for writers. So
So
it,
Patrick, you don't know this, but Pat and I are programming co-chairs for our local Connecticut chapter of Sisters in Crime. And I'm thinking Cop Camp Zoom for next
ooh,
fall.
all right,
Yeah, that would be
we'll
great.
talk. We'll talk. We will talk. All right, let's start wrapping this up. We're getting
Okay,
kind of late here.
yeah.
Now, what's next for all of you, and where can we find you online if we're looking for you?
I'll jump in here. So my website is wendywhitman.com. On Instagram, I'm at Wendy Whitman Author. And I, picking up for what something Pat said a few questions ago, the marketing and all of that has taken me away from writing. So I haven't written in a while. So at some point I'm gonna have to hunker down and start writing again, but nothing to promise yet.
Okay.
Nothing out there to promise yet.
All right. Debbie?
So I am at Deborah Levison author on Facebook and Instagram, and my website is Debbie Levison, DEBBIE
Okay.
LEVISON. So I have my third book, which is still in the editing phases. It has a working title, but I don't know if it'll be published under that name,
Okay.
so it's not a lot of point
All right. Sounds good.
announcing it.
So I can be, well, my website is, you get to it, patriciadunnauthor.com or tmdunnauthor.com. On Instagram and Facebook, I'm Patricia Dunn Author, pretty easy to find. I'm even on X as She Writes. I got that early on when X was something at Twitter, and it wasn't, I couldn't get that name today because a million people would want it. But nobody was on it then. But the main way you can get to me, or if you want to sign up for my newsletter, or just send me a note with any questions, and please tell your audience, I love taking questions from people. If they go to my website, they could just like send me a note or an email through there. And I guess TM Dunn Author is usually the easiest way to find it.
All right. Sounds good. Well, I can't thank you enough for being on the show today. This was a lot of fun.
This was great. Thank you so
Thank
much.
you
Thanks so much, Patrick.
This was
We had
great.
fun.
Awesome.
All right.
Pretty
Now,
fun.
don't go anywhere. I'm going to turn off
Okay.
the recording, but